Good morning. I'm Vontrice Jones, Director of Agency Services here at the Greater Cleveland Food Bank, and I have the privilege of being the chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you that are tuning in for our session entitled Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, More Than Food. At the Food Bank, we are proud to have a DE&I council comprised of every department within the organization. This work is so important to us, so much so that we have goals embedded in our strategic plan to ensure we are as diverse, equitable, and inclusive for our staff, volunteers, clients, partners, and community at large. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are a wide variety of ways to incorporate tactics and strategies for your distribution efforts while also going beyond food to gain insight on the root causes of hunger. We are pleased to have Elena Ali, Manager of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with our parent organization, Feeding America, to present their equity journey for our 200 food banks across the country. We will also have Leah Williams-Rumsley, Senior Director of Advocacy from the Food Bank of Southeastern Virginia and Eastern Shore, to present on strategies that food bank members can incorporate in their efforts. We're looking forward to learning more, so if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A chat box. Hopefully we won't run out of time, but hopefully we won't run out of time to answer all of them, but if we should, we'll follow up with you as this session is being recorded. I'll now turn it over to our first presenter, Elena Ali from Feeding America.
Thank you so much, Vontrice. Good morning, everyone. My name is Elena Ali. As Vontrice mentioned, I am the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Manager at Feeding America Network Office. I recently joined Feeding America around 7 months ago. I am an attorney by training, and prior to joining Feeding America, I worked at a nonprofit where I advocated for survivors of violence. So that would be individuals that had been trafficked, survivors of domestic violence or stalking, etc. I then transitioned into employment law, where I spent the last few years. I did investigations of sexual misconduct, discrimination, and harassment, initially for a government agency, and then I moved on to doing the same work for a school district here in Chicago. I am now privileged to be involved in the development and implementation of Feeding America's racial equity journey. And it is my absolute pleasure and joy to share space with Leah Rumsley. As mentioned earlier, she's the Senior Director of Advocacy at the Food Bank of Southeastern Virginia and the Eastern Shore. I'll turn it over to Leah now to introduce herself.
Thank you, Elena. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I'm pleased to be here in the capacity of co-chair for Feeding America's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee. And I also serve in the role of Diversity and Equity Inclusion Task Force Chair for our own organization. So I'm looking forward to talking with you all today via the question and answer and via the chat. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Leah. All right, so on the next slide, we will talk about what we're here to do today. So we'll start off by talking about Feeding America's equity philosophy. How do we define equity? What does it truly mean? We'll then spend some time discussing Feeding America's equity plan. So this will include going over what we've accomplished in FY21 and what our goals are for FY22. Leah and I will then talk about network support and engagement, and then Leah will go in depth over advancing equity at your own food bank. Next slide, please. I've attended multiple trainings regarding equity, where equity is never actually defined, but just assumed to be understood, which at times for me has resulted in a disparate experience of the training or speaking engagement. So I always want to begin by talking about what equity means. And so here, we're going to talk about how Feeding America defines equity. When I talk about equity, I'm talking about keeping the people most impacted by food insecurity at the center of decision making. That means analyzing root causes of food insecurity and striving to eliminate unjust policies that create unequitable outcomes for certain individuals and communities. I also want to explore this idea of centering people in our work, which I think you'll hear often as we continue, not just with this presentation today, but equity work at Feeding America. So when we're talking about centering people in our work, we're talking about anchoring our organization and everything we do in the communities we serve. We need to elevate the voices that are experiencing the very barriers we're trying to eliminate. This is happening in order to provide individuals within their communities greater access to resources. In other words, in order to truly understand how and what can bring us closer to our mission of reducing food insecurity, we need to talk to, prioritize, and raise the voices experiencing food insecurity at the highest rates. And while there are many, many components to equity, we recognize that racial inequity has resulted in poorer outcomes across the board for Black, Brown, Indigenous, and individuals of color, including higher rates of food insecurity and poverty, and worse health and health outcomes. By addressing racial equity, we position ourselves to make both a broad and deep impact with the people who have historically been the most marginalized and systemically oppressed. Next slide. So at Feeding America, we're taking an outcomes and process-based equity approach. What does that mean? As an outcome, we achieve racial equity when race no longer determines one's socioeconomic outcomes. Essentially, when everyone has what they need to thrive, no matter where they live. And as a process, we apply racial equity practices when those most impacted by structural racial inequity are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of the institutional policies and practices that impact their lives. It's not simply enough to invite individuals from the communities most impacted to the food insecurity table, right? You'll hear this concept when we talk about inclusion, about who's at the table. Look around, who do you see? Who's missing? And that's a really, really, really important piece of inclusion. But what we have to also be mindful of and really thrive for is sharing ownership of the table. Since this is an individual, this is a issue, food insecurity, that individuals are experiencing day in and day out. So by centering around their voices, they take control of the decisions that impact their daily lives. So that's sort of how we define equity and the approach that we're taking. I'd like to pause here for just a moment and share space with Leah and see if Leah can share some of her expertise and any thoughts that she may have.
Thank you. So one of the things that I like to ask folks to consider when looking at equity, particularly racial equity, is a concept called the curb cut effect. So the curb cut is the piece of the sidewalk that slopes down into the crosswalk so that everybody can easily access the street and the other side of the street without having to make a step up. The curb cut was built for differently abled individuals who might get around in wheelchairs, but the curb cut is enjoyed by everyone. Women pushing strollers, men pushing strollers, grocery baskets, movers using dollies. So there are a number of things that folks can use, the curb cut to access the sidewalk for. And so the idea around it is that it was created for the most vulnerable population, but the benefit of it expands to the greater community. And we ask that you think about those things when considering an approach to equity.
Thank you, Leah. Leah always has the most amazing thoughts in bringing everything together. I appreciate you, Leah. Absolutely agreed. I think that when we address racial inequities, everyone experiencing food insecurity benefits. Moving next slide, please. So what exactly are we solving for here? We need to remain focused on our mission of advancing change in America by ensuring equitable access to nutritious food for all. We know that Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous and tribal individuals experience food insecurity at a drastically higher rate than their white counterparts, and have historically faced these conditions due to the deeply rooted system of injustice upon which our society is built. So we begin by investing in communities most impacted. We co-create programs with community organizations, and you'll hear me saying this over and over, co-creation is key. We want to diversify our staff, and we can't just stop there. When you talk about diversity, we talk about diversifying our staff, but the next step to that is setting up the diverse staff for success once they've entered your organization, providing a space where they feel comfortable, where they feel welcomed, showing up as their authentic selves, right? So setting up our diverse staff for success and always working to build capacity to advance EDI in the organization and across the network. Next, please. So how exactly do we determine what to solve for? Data. We are prioritizing people and places who have disproportionately faced persistent food insecurity according to the best available evidence. For the last 17 years, the USDA has reported that Black and Brown households experience food insecurity 2 to 3 times more than their white counterparts. Prior to the pandemic, 19.2% of Black individuals that are non-Hispanic, 15.8% of Latino individuals, and 22.6% of Native American individuals experienced food insecurity compared to 8.1% of white non-Hispanic individuals. That's prior to the pandemic. Since the start of the pandemic, as we're all aware, food insecurity has increased tremendously across the board, right? Across the board for every single person. But with Black, Latino, and Native American individuals have been hardest hit. And so while the numbers that I'm about to share aren't exactly comparable to the pre-COVID estimates I just shared, a study by the Urban Institute suggests that in September 2020, Latino and Black adult food insecurity rates reached 30.5% and 28.2% respectively, approximately double that of white adult households, which is at about 14.7%. We also know that regionally, the highest average rates of county food insecurity are found in the South, which represents 84% of counties with the highest rates of food insecurity. Additionally, the rural South specifically faces the highest levels of food insecurity. In 2019, the food insecurity rate was 15% for the rural South compared to the overall food insecurity rate of 11%. Next, please. So I realize that's a lot of data and a lot of numbers, and you have access to even more detailed data within the communities that you serve. And at a larger scale, you have access to various Feeding America dashboards. But I'd like to spend some time to go over Feeding America's equity journey, right? We know the data. We've talked about what equity means. We know what we're solving for. How did we come to the conclusion of what we're solving for? But what are the concrete steps that we're taking, right? What are we doing in our daily lives? What are the changes that we're making? So I want to talk about the steps that we've taken and what we plan to take. Again, the future plan that we're building is always changing. We learn more as we grow. We know pandemic has been changing things rapidly. So as we learn and adapt, we're growing and changing. But what do we have planned so far for FY22 to really center the individuals most impacted by food insecurity? Next, please. So going back to FY21, we focused on deepening our commitment to the equity journey by building common language, frameworks, and protocols. Just as I said in the beginning of this presentation, a lot of times we'll talk about equity. My title at Feeding America is Manager of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. But if we as an organization cannot come together to define what we mean when we're talking about those terms, it is difficult to start building the change that we're hoping for, that is our goal. Now, again, those definitions may change, we may grow, but we need to have some common ground so that we're talking about the same thing. So we spent some time in training, in community, in building common language, frameworks, and protocols. We built meaningful partnerships to learn and grow, and we continue to build partnerships with consultants, with community partners, with individuals that can help us grow. We're making a commitment to diversify our staff. As I mentioned earlier, that comes with another flip side of the coin, which is also setting up that staff for success. We're increasing our investments in communities of color. We're also advocating for government policies that work to dismantle structural barriers and positively impact the lives of people facing hunger. I know I mentioned multiple times we're going to talk about concrete steps that we took, and the things that I've just talked about may not seem concrete. So we'll talk about some steps that we've taken. Next slide. So within Feeding America, we have formalized our equity statement, right? Like I mentioned, it's important to have those terms. What are we talking about? What do we mean when we say inclusion? What do we mean when we say diversity? So we have a formalized equity statement as of right now. And again, we'll revisit this in the future as we learn and grow. We've rolled out EDI training with our thought partners at Center for Equity and Inclusion. And we divided this training up, not by departments, which I think is traditionally how trainings are looked at. We did it by sphere of influence. So the executive team went through a training first with a foundational piece and training specific to their role as the executive team member. We also did the same thing for people managers. So individuals that have direct reports, we provided a foundational piece of training, and then we had training specific to their role, their sphere of influence. And now we're looking to enroll training for all staff. Again, it's going to be the same way. We're going to have a foundational piece and then specific to all staff roles. All these trainings that we're providing also have follow-up sessions, because as we know, the real work of trainings begins after the training is over, right? It's really about embedding the tools that we are learning in the training in our daily work. And the follow-up sessions are meant to support the infusion of equity into our daily interactions at work. So for example, for people managers, our first set of follow-ups were in June of this year. The next set of follow-ups are starting up in next year. So we're going to continue to check in, see what works, see what are the barriers that people managers or other individuals facing the trainings are really going through, and adapt and continue to provide that support. I won't go through this entire slide, but one additional thing I would like to highlight is that we're also providing support to our employee resource groups, which have been created around shared identities, experiences, needs, and interests. They are an invaluable resource that provide a space for employees to connect, to find community. But they're also a really, really, really important way that we share power in the organization. Because as I mentioned, co-creation here is key. So ERGs, or employee resource groups, actively participate in the co-creation of initiatives and projects in service of individuals and communities facing hunger. I'm really excited to share that we're currently in the process of creating an ERG for our Native and tribal brothers and sisters. We hope to have that before the end of the year. We're also in the process of creating an ERG toolkit that contains information regarding creation of ERGs, what works, what doesn't work, sample sheets to track budgets and impact, just a full robust toolkit for ERGs, because we want to take some of the stress away of formalizing an ERG and really welcome people to build spaces of shared experiences and interests. And we're also working on a way to build a version of the toolkit that may potentially be helpful for network members. I just want to always be intentional and mindful to not be paternalistic and recognize the uniqueness of each food bank's equity journey. So we want to share resources in a manner to show what works for ERGs at Feeding America and how that might be helpful for network members. So we will be working on the ERG toolkit version for network members and sharing that pretty soon as well. Next slide, please. Again, a lot of words on this slide. I will not go through the entire slide. I will not read this, but I just want to highlight a couple of things here as well. We have invested in research to learn public perceptions about the intersections of racism and food insecurity. So we're always learning and growing. We also made public commitments to equity in an effort to hold ourselves accountable and be transparent. We then also followed up by publishing progress on those commitments. So the commitments that we had laid out, of course, we didn't accomplish everything, but we wanted to be transparent. So we talked about where are we in the process? What have we accomplished so far? Where are we moving to? And they're all on the website that you can have access to, or you can reach out to me and I can direct you in that for those commitments. Next slide. So those are all things that we've talked about in FY21. What are we looking to do in FY22? Right now, we have 3 specific areas of focus for FY22. First one is capacity building. Second one is internal messaging. And third one is network support and engagement. So what do we mean by capacity building, right? Capacity building is really looking at sustainability of this work. What are ongoing learning opportunities that are needed or required? What organizational support is needed? It's really a process to continue to embed equity into the Feeding America identity and finding ways to hold ourselves accountable to this work. Anytime we're involved in equity work, the flip side of that is always holding ourselves accountable. The next capacity, internal messaging, that's really about breaking down silos with transparent communication across all different departments. So for example, earlier this year, there were 4 listening sessions that were co-hosted by Feeding America's equity team members and executive team members to really listen to what is Feeding America staff feeling about the initiatives that we have so far. What are things that are working? What are we doing well that we need to continue doing? The flip side of that, what are things that aren't working well? What are spaces that we may have neglected? What are things that we need to do? So after these open listening sessions, we shared our findings in a transparent manner, while of course respecting confidentiality. So we removed names or departments or any other thing that would help someone narrow down or identify an individual, but we shared what was said, right? So we're trying to continue to be more transparent with communication across the organization. With my role, I have the unique privilege of being part of different meetings. So I get to see how all the different departments are part of this equity journey. What are they doing to advance equity within their departments, within their daily lives? But maybe those departments don't get to see that. They don't get to have that communication. So we're really going to work to bring that communication and work together for internal messaging. Network support and engagement is really about providing support to network members on their unique EDI journeys and including robust support for the Network EDI Advisory Committee. I also want to recognize, I keep mentioning network members' EDI journeys or network members' unique EDI journeys, and network members are kind of spoken of as like a big homogenous group, which they are not. We recognize the different communities that network members serve, the different staff members that network members have. So each network member has a unique EDI journey within the communities that they're serving, the people that they are working with. So just really trying to be recognizing that, being intentional with our work there, and celebrating that diversity and uniqueness in the EDI journeys. Next slide, please. I'd like to now focus on advancing equity within the network, and I'd like to share this space with Leah. Next slide. So I have the privilege, along with some of my colleagues, to support the Network EDI Advisory Committee, which is composed of network members from different food banks with different titles, experiences, and identities. And in July, the committee members participated in a 3-day intensive training with our thought partners at Center for Equity and Inclusion. And this was a training really to build common frameworks, acquire tools to examine structural barriers, and I think most importantly, get to know each other, you know, find community with each other, find the strength that we have as a group. And the committee will make recommendations to members in Feeding America regarding network-wide EDI strategy and work to implement network's proposed EDI plans to address the needs of those most impacted by food insecurity. We are fortunate to have one of the co-chairs, Leah, here with us today. So Leah, if you wanted to mention anything else about the Network EDI Advisory Committee, I welcome you to do that.
Thank you, Elena. So we really hope that network members will leverage this as an opportunity to grow and learn. We recognize that Not all organizations will start in the same place. Not all organizations will apply the same filter to equity work, but we are here at your service and ready and able to convey the priorities of the advisory committee and also to aid the organizations in starting this journey or continuing on it from wherever they are.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leah. And next slide, and Leah, take it away.
Thank you. So that's a great segue into advancing equity at your food bank or at your network organization. And as we go through these suggestions, I recognize that some organizations have already started the work. So please feel free to let us know and fellow participants know about any critical steps that have been valuable that you've already taken to advance equity at your organization. And you can do that by entering those efforts in the chat box. And then, of course, continue to enter questions if you have any in the Q&A. So the first thing you want to do when you're looking at the equity conversation is ask yourself the context, belief, and action. So for your organization, an example of that process might be in terms of the context. What is the problem or history or narrative that this value is addressing? For some organizations, it could be that there's a system of privileges or a system that privileges some over others. We also recognize that within each of us exists the potential to perpetuate the very systems that we're trying to disrupt. Think about the belief. What is the belief or counter narrative that the effort or the value of equity would be grounded in? A constant process of reflection and action, and that we check and recheck our privileges we carry and identities we prioritize. That could be one of the ways of, putting into context the belief. And then action. So what is the action or commitment or obligation that would come from the context and the belief? What might it look like in action at our organization? An example of that could be creating systems that center the voices, experiences, and decisions of those most harmed by systemic oppression. So once you have the context, the belief, and the action, you have to start having the conversation. And it's very important that leadership at an organization is the initiator of the conversation. Look internally first. Of course, you can't change the world if you don't have your own house in order. So do the current priorities at your organization advance diversity, equity, and inclusion? And start with internal equity, looking at your guidelines, your hiring, your pay, your promotion, policies and opportunities, and everything internal. Even gift-giving policies or gift acceptance policies could be involved in the process of an internal screening for equity practice. And then consult with an external professional. It's okay not to know where to start or what to do. External consultants can also overcome filters that we have in place as a current part of our organizational culture. Next slide, please. So when you're advancing equity at your food bank, you're more likely to commit when you weave it into the organizational fiber. So develop an equity or diversity statement. As you can see in the photo that I have on the slide, that same poster is right behind me because we have done that at our organization. We have included equity as a value and we also have a diversity statement. And we take our mission, vision, and values very seriously, and everything that we do has a direct tie right back to our mission, vision, and values. So you can add it to your organizational values. You can align it with the vision or reinforce the mission. But the purpose is to design equity-centered organizational values and weave it into the fiber of the organization. Establish an internal coalition or staff committee. So the first thing I want to say about that is that when you do that, this committee should not include senior management. The reality is that some folks just are not comfortable having difficult conversations when senior management members are in the room. So include representatives from every department of your organization. Allow the group to identify opportunities and lead the effort internally and then eventually externally. Advanced training is a valuable tool for a group like this. And then the role of senior management in this capacity would be to serve as a liaison to kind of run decisions to ground as they're made. And then establish affinity groups. We all need safe spaces to have dialogue with others who have similar experiences to our own. And finally, develop a roadmap for equity, diversity, and inclusion engagement for all staff. Identify and implement ongoing training, include annual unconscious bias trainings, include communication trainings, particularly for management, engage in regular and organized intergroup dialogue, and then make DEI training a regular part of onboarding so that new team members are introduced to this aspect of the culture early on. Next slide, please. And then be prepared to be uncomfortable. I'm sure you've heard people say before, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So set some rules to navigate group dynamics. Prepare yourself and your colleagues. Be willing to do things differently and experience discomfort, because the fact is that the easy conversations typically are not the right conversations, nor do they lead to meaningful change. Stay engaged. When you join a group, whether it be for intergroup dialogue or whether it be an affinity group with people who are experiencing the same things you are, you want to leave distractions behind. Participate fully. Bring your full self to participation in the equity conversation. Distraction in this space conveys as disinterest. And then listen to understand. And this is key. Listen to understand without interrupting. Try to imagine what's being shared. Don't take it personally. Nobody's talking about you specifically. And then if you hear something that you don't understand, respectfully request clarification. Speak your own truth responsibly. Take care not to cause harm to others when speaking. And something to consider when you do that is try to stay away from statements that are pointed at other groups of individuals. Words like they, words like you. Instead, when you're speaking your own truth, center it and use words like I. Expect and accept non-closure. So let's face it, there are simply some things that we see and interpret differently, and that's okay. But don't diminish or invalidate the experience of others. And another popular phrase that we hear all the time is perception is reality, because it is for the person who is experiencing it. And then maintain confidentiality. this is probably the single most important point regarding group dynamics. These conversations are difficult enough without the added fear and discomfort of everyone knowing that all that has been shared and by whom. That's also another reason that we ask that when you form a staff committee, don't involve senior management directly in the committee, at least not right away. You want people to feel that this is a safe space, a sanctuary, if you will, to have these difficult conversations to get the equity work started. Thank you.
Thank you both, Elena and Leah, for your insight, for sharing your experiences with us. This is such important work that I think we all need to become engaged in. We'll now go to questions from the Q&A box. And so the first one is, how do we initiate conversations at our program site? We have some board members and volunteers who we fear may not be open to incorporating some of this dialogue in our work. What would either of you suggest?
I guess I'll jump in, and then Alina, if you'd like to add something. So this is, I have had to work with difficult groups of people at times, because I also work with all of the legislators in our service area. So we serve 11 cities and counties, and so we have 2 senators and 3 congressmen, and we have 16 state delegates, and we have 9 state level senators. And then we also have over 300 city council members, mayors, and boards, if you will. And I think that one of the most important places to start when you want to have this conversation is with the data. If you present data, right, no one can deny data, and no one can deny facts, historical facts that are publicly known. So you can share data that's been gathered. You can share examples of public policy, if that's sort of where you want to start the conversation, and about how systems and structures have held certain people or certain communities right in the place where they are and not allowed opportunities for advancement. And once you start to dissect and unpack the various layers, then the conversation sort of naturally begins. Now, it's not going to make people any more comfortable, but you can also sort of open by sharing the ground rules, where, we have different filters. We're not going to see things the same way, but it's important that we can have honest dialogue with one another about the different experiences that our neighbors are having in the community versus, our perception of what those experiences are.
I absolutely agree with Leah. This work is very difficult. And I think one of the things that we can do is, as Leah mentioned, recognize that there's a difference of opinion, right? Recognize that I'm coming from a specific experience. I'm looking at things a certain way and you're looking at them a different way. Not in an accusatory manner or anything, but just recognizing the reality that exists, that certain people, based on their experiences, may not have been exposed to different the different experiences of other individuals, may not fully understand or know how to engage with structural racism. So first of all, recognizing that that difference exists and not trying to pretend that it doesn't and we're on the same page, just recognizing that that exists. And data is key. A lot of people can talk around other things, but it is difficult to deny data. And I think also it's important to work with individuals that are on board, right? So while you have people that have different opinions about this work and may not be maybe hesitant to start doing this thing or don't know where to start, there are people that are willing to start, that are ready to start, that get the work, that have had those experiences, that know what our communities are facing, right? So working with those individuals, because as much as I want this work to be move forward, I also want to always be mindful of the people that are doing this work. You have to take care of yourself so that you can continue this work. So find communities in those individuals. Maybe ERGs is the way to begin, right? Maybe you build employee resource groups around certain interests. It don't have to be around racial affinity group, right? We have, for example, ERGs around Black employees, for Hispanic employees, for Asian employees, but that's not all where ERGs are supposed to be. They could be more. That's also a great place to start, but it could be, we have ERGs that are around lived experience. So individuals that have faced food insecurity growing up or are currently facing it and also work in this space. So maybe you start one around advocacy for individuals that you know, and from there you start leveraging the data. So you're not doing this alone. Find community, right? We have a network EDI advisory committee. We have resources. Let's work together. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to be able to leverage the relationships that we do have. So maybe you find community there, and then together you talk about the data. You talk about the impact that you can have. You talk about how you're not neglecting one person to pick another. You're looking at data and trying to make a broad and deep impact, right? You can have those conversations once you find your community and ways to engage. Don't, I don't want anyone to feel like they're fighting this fight alone. So find the community. And I think building those resources and voices, because I learn so much from our ERGs on a daily basis. So I think that might be a good place to start.
That's pretty good advice from both of you. I will say here at the food bank, we've started to do a number of things, although we have strategic goals around DE&I, but some of the smaller things that I just like to add, some of our partners could use an e-signature at the end of their correspondence internally or externally as she, her, and hers. So that's at the end of my e-signature. You can also conduct an audit of some of your company's policies to see is the pay fair? Is it fair across the board? Is it fair across different groups? And I want to be mindful of when we talk about DE&I, that it goes beyond race. It extends to gender, it extends to age, it extends to ability. And so that's why I love Leah's comment about the curb cut, the example of the curb cut, because we pretty much can all relate to that, because at some point or another, if you haven't pushed a stroller, maybe you've had groceries or you've had someone with a wheelchair with a different ability. And so those are things that we can pretty much relate to. We have another question in the box, and it says, what suggestions do you have for the Greater Cleveland Food Bank to support our network of partners as they begin to incorporate or enhance their DEI awareness into their hunger relief programs?
Lena, you want to go first this time?
Sure. I think one of the things that's been really important for me is, and I mentioned this earlier in my presentation too, is knowing what we're talking about, right? A lot of people talk about equity. A lot of people talk about inclusion. As I mentioned earlier, for example, I've heard a lot of conversation about inclusion of who's at the table, or those other things about inclusions about who's at the dance or being asked to dance, all of those different things. But you never know who's coming to the room and what is their sense of inclusion. Have you ever felt included? Have you walked in a room and felt comfortable knowing my thoughts are going to be represented even if I don't speak today? Or have you walked in a room and said, I have decision-making power here, or I can show up as my authentic self? So just the word inclusion itself has so many different meanings. And that's not, my attorney brain is really happy looking at words and meanings and semantics, but that has real life consequences and impact. So I think one of the things that is very important for me is training. I'm a student of this work. I learn on a daily basis from trainings that are officially carried out by our consulting partners or by finding community in people. People teach me on a daily basis. So I think one of the things is finding either trainings or another way where you come together to define, what are we talking about? How do we define diversity? For diversity, is it important for us to go to HR and say, hey, here's the metrics that we have, and here's how we need to diversify? Or is it really important to say, we need to diversify, and as we're diversifying, we need to talk about how we're going to set those individuals up for success, We need to talk about how we're going to change the space to include everybody that is coming in an ownership manner so that they can have meaningful impact in decision making. Are those the conversation you're having when you talk about diversity, or is it something else? So I'm not saying there's one thing that's right or wrong, because it's very unique to where you are, the communities you're serving, and what's happening, but it's important to be on the same page. And those conversations, when you're having them, I think the important part there is also building community. So when you're working on these definitions, you get to know the people that you're working with. You get to know who you can rely on. You get to know who you partner with. You get to know whose capacity, sometimes you just don't have capacity for certain things. And I think the other thing that I also want to highlight is with equity work, a lot of times equity work is seen as an afterthought. So you'll have a program, for example, right? You're working on an initiative, you're working on something, and near the end of the project, people will look backwards to see, is this offensive in any way? Am I leaving anyone out? Is when I put this out there, is it going to sound iffy? Is there going to be some? That's not how equity works, right? Whenever you're at the beginning of the programs, you have to change that mindset and making sure equity is a foundational piece of what we're doing. So instead of presenting an initiative to diverse groups to see if they see any red flags, it is having those groups, the community members, the community organizations involved in the very foundation of building the programs so that it's co-created. You're asking those questions of what are the assumptions that I'm bringing to this issue, right? How does this increase or decrease racial equity? What are unintended consequences of what I'm about to do? So having that as a foundational piece as well. So I think just starting off, some of the things that I'd be mindful of is making sure we know what we're talking about, and we can explore that. You can create it and it doesn't have to be set in stone. As I mentioned, you can grow and change definitions, but having a basic foundation around that, and then also making sure equity is embedded in the foundation and throughout initiatives, not just at the very end.
I plus one, Alina. We're like sisters in equity, so we have very similar thought processes and responses to things. But credibility is king in many things. If you lose credibility, then folks will stop listening. So it's very important that you do your research and collect your data to build the case for why the conversation needs to be had in the first place. It's not enough to say, oh, well, the pandemic has revealed racial disparities. That's true, but have that be accompanied by key data points that are taken right from your own service area. And the second thing is absolutely bring the community to the table. So when you're talking about doing this with your own partners, you want to engage in coalition building, because diversity, equity, and inclusion is just really sort of the first half of the journey. There's a cute little graphic that shows the three men watching the baseball game from behind the fence, and one man standing on two boxes, one man's standing on one box, and one man doesn't have a box. And then it says, equality. It shows equality where everybody gets one box, and then it shows equity where everybody gets the box that they need in order to see over the fence. But I would beg you to dig deeper and recognize the next step in the process, which is liberation, where there's no fence in the first place. Then nobody even needs a box to stand on. Just remove the structural barrier. And then to go even a step further, justice. Put a uniform on the people watching. They should be in the game. So it's just that simple. Involve them. Nobody can tell you what the community needs more than the community itself.
That is so good. That was such a great analogy of going a step further to just remove the structural barrier. Thank you. Thank you for that. We did a survey quite a while ago and found that there was probably around 30% or so of our partner agencies that operate on a budget of $1,000 or less annually. So many of our partners that that are within our network, they operate with no paid staff, they have smaller budgets. What are some things that they can do to begin their DE&I journey?
I'll jump in. So my entire career has been in nonprofit. So I've only ever done what I do for nonprofit organizations. So I'm accustomed to budgetary constraints. But I will say there's a couple of things you can do. In several cities, there is a professional volunteer organization. See if you have one. If you do, you may be able to gain access to something called a service enterprise volunteer, which is a person who does something professionally, but they will donate their time and expertise to you as a full-time equivalent, and they can use it as their own tax write-off or whatever the case, but they can donate a service to you from their own professional expertise to help you get a project completed. Another thing you can do is gather with other groups that are already doing the work. So, for example, we don't necessarily have a small budget here at this food bank, but I'm a part of Feeding America's national advisory committee for EDI work. And I benefit from the training that Feeding America has invested in to ensure that we are well equipped to provide support to the network. And of course, because I work here, this food bank benefits also from the things that I'm able to take back and pass along. So, so I would say, dig through the internet and network in your community. Get on LinkedIn and see if there are professionals who do this work who would be willing. Let them know you don't have a budget, but you recognize the need, and then present your data to make the need more compelling and say, would you be willing to come and help us, and we can provide you with some type of statement that quantifies the value of their time so they can get something from it on the back end.
That's good. A few of the things that we've done organizationally here at the food bank was just being purposeful and including and supporting minority-owned businesses and prioritizing diversity in our marketing materials. We've also expanded our recruitment efforts to target more diverse candidates, standardizing our recruitment process and interview questions so that everyone has an even playing field. We've educated our hiring managers on their department demographics so that way they can take a look and assess the entire situation when there's opportunity for growth or to bring in new folks. We've also released a public statement condemning the murder of George Floyd. So that did not cost us anything. And so we used our voice as a staff to help address systemic racism. And so this past June, for Juneteenth, for the second year in a row, we celebrated as a united staff. We celebrated that national holiday, and then we've also we've flown a pride flag. We've done activities as a staff just to be supportive for Pride Month. So those are some things that I think as well can be incorporated into some of our day-to-day actions just to make that step forward. So when you talk about being inclusive, and I'm trying to be mindful of time, when we talk about being inclusive and looking at culturally appropriate foods in various communities, Elena, what has Feeding America done or plans to do in order to help source culturally appropriate foods throughout the network?
So that is part of a larger conversation that we are currently having. And as I mentioned earlier with network members, the uniqueness of each food bank and the communities that they are in, I think at the moment we are working to really have a mindset change within the organization, that culturally appropriate food is part of our identity. It's not something that we have in certain network food banks, or in, when the need has arise, it's something that's already available that we want to make sure is across the board. So I think that's part of a larger conversation that we're working on right now. I don't really have any specific updates on that, but I know that that's the conversation of, it does not need to be in response to something that we hear. It does not need to be, certain communities, we've already done that and we continue to work on it. It needs to be something that's across the board and a staple of what we do. So that's the conversation that is happening. And because that means a lot of large steps, there's a lot of moving pieces. So we are working to continue that conversation and see how we can build on it.
Good.
Really quickly, also just being mindful of time. If we want to go to the next slide, I want people to have an opportunity to note down also our contact information. If there's something that you maybe are not comfortable sharing in this forum, but wanted to ask us in a more confidential manner, although Wantrese has been wonderful in making sure every question is confidential so far, but if you're not comfortable, please continue to reach out to, I'm going to volunteer Leah as well, Leah and myself for any further conversation, but I just wanted to put that out there. But please, Wantrese, continue.
Okay, perfect. So last question. What are some ways we can get feedback from clients at our food pantries about their experience so that we can make changes that best suits their needs?
So that's something that we've worked to do in a number of capacities, but you have to survey them, and the survey process cannot be complicated or extensive, and it cannot require people to need to read. So, maybe 2 or 3 questions. What are we doing well? What do we need to do more of? And what do we need to stop doing altogether? And you can just ask those questions and assign a volunteer to collect that information from guests as they come seeking assistance. You can also offer an incentive for folks who participate. We've done that before. We've been able to get gift cards from one of our large retail grocers, boxes of them for $25 each. So if they participate in the survey, we give them a $25 grocery store gift card. So there's some things like that you can do to encourage folks to participate.
And I think it's also important to continue to have follow-ups as well. I know certain people are on survey fatigue of, I did this survey, I think I did it, I'm not sure where it went, but having a follow-up of your survey, the time that you took to allow us to understand what you're experiencing has resulted in whatever initiatives and programs that we've resulted in. So having a follow-up, even if that's a transparent communication, or if that's a follow-up survey of, okay, we've accomplished these things, now we have the next set of 3 questions to continue building on what we've done. So showing that progress as well.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. Be on the lookout for an email with the recorded session in the upcoming days. We're so happy to have had the opportunity for Elena and Leah to join us to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion across the network and specific tips and strategies we could all use. So we're about out of time. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this morning. And please be sure to come back this afternoon for our next session at about 1 o'clock, entitled Creative Distribution Strategies. So thank you both. We appreciate having you and your insight, and wishing everyone to be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.